Hello everybody, welcome to the Cooper Smith Career Consulting Crash Course or video for International Business. International Business is a course that kind of follows up on some of the other courses that we offer in terms of business. We also offer management and marketing, and International Business kind of, carries forward those two courses and some of the other areas of business in general with a focus on international business, with a focus on multinational corporations, outsourcing, things like that. We're going to discuss a whole bunch of things that are relevant to various different types of business disciplines, but that are focused on businesses outside the United States or working with companies outside the United States, even if you're an American company. We're going to look at things like economic theories, policies, business strategies, and organizational structures that affect businesses with operations or with dealings outside the United States. You can see on the list of course objectives that we're going to discuss things like economic integration, foreign exchanges, international monetary systems, strategies of R&D, all sorts of things that are relevant in general to international business. You'll take a final examination once you finish studying the material, be graded on a conventional 0 to 100 scale. Hopefully you'll get closer to this end of the scale than to that end of the scale. That's of course our hope. We've got a textbook over here, which is International Business. You have the ISBN over here. You can get a hold of it that way. Also in the syllabus, of course, you have, if you want to print out this PowerPoint presentation that I'm looking at over here to study, to review, if you want to print it out without printing out all 110 pages or 115 pages on separate pages, you can print them out 4 at a time by following these directions. So with that in mind, let us look at chapter number 1. And chapter number 1 is entitled Globalization. Globalization and really kind of a general introduction to what international business is and how it operates. Globalization means a shift towards a world with more interdependent and integrated world economy. This, of course, is a function of much better communications than we used to have. In the old days, you had a factory, you pretty much dealt with everything here in wherever your factory was. You distribute it to local distributors or domestic distributors. Your retailers were domestic, your customers were domestic, pretty much everybody that you dealt with was within the country that you were operating. Globalization, on the other hand, with the internet and with free or cheap telephone and video conferencing options, you can deal with people wherever they are very easily. If it's more profitable to deal with somebody in China or deal with somebody in Europe, then you can do it just as easily. Whereas in the old days, you had to mail them letters or have very expensive long-distance telephone calls in order to speak to them. So the world is moving away from national economies, which are self-contained, to an integrated global economic system. So, for example, a Canadian might work on a computer designed in Japan that was assembled in Mexico by Dell, which is an American company, from components made in the US and Korea that was fabricated from Australian metal and Malaysian glass. That's just one example where you have 6 or 7 different countries, or people, or technologies in 6 or 7 different countries that are going to be relevant to the production of one particular computer. Or an American might drive to work in a car designed in Germany that was assembled in Mexico by Daimler Chrysler, which is a German/American company, or used to be, from components made in the US and Japan that were fabricated from Korean steel and Malaysian rubber. Now, of course, this could have happened any time. I mean, you could have theoretically moved goods just as easily in, 30, 50, 60, 100 years ago even. And people did, of course. People did import goods from countries to, in fact, in the 1850s when Commodore Matthew Perry started trade with Japan, obviously, even though we didn't nearly have the same kind of communication technology that we did today. Now, the difference, of course, is the communication issue. In factories, shipping expenses have decreased over the last 100 years, but not that dramatically. What's really decreased is communication. You can supervise somebody from working for you in Mumbai, India, almost as well as you can supervise somebody working in the next office. Well, I mean, maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but that's really the idea of globalization. Global markets, and the reason why there's been globalization recently, is because there are fewer trade barriers between nations, as nations realize that it can be profitable to trade with countries that have abundance of resources or that have abundance of technology or labor. Countries have been tearing down trade barriers, like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, the European Union. These are all trade agreements between countries that allow much more freely for goods to be imported and exported. National markets are merging with each other, such as in the European Union. Consumers' tastes have become a global norm. People want goods that are produced cheaply in China. They want cars that are designed in Europe. They want wine from France. They want water from the Alps. They want oil from the Middle East or from South America. They want, pretty much people know of and are able to easily find out about goods that are available from pretty much everywhere, and so naturally people want these things. And of course, basic products are also available worldwide. Just to take one simple example, think about fruits and vegetables. It used to be that you couldn't get certain fruits and vegetables outside of season, and although some fruits still are seasonal, primarily, especially in the United States, you can pretty much have any kind of fruit you like any time of year, because even if it's not in season in the United States, it might be seasonal somewhere else in the world, and it can be imported relatively easily. In general, things can be imported relatively easily. You have global institutions which help regulate, manage, and police the global marketplace, things like the World Trade Organization, the International Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and even the United Nations itself can help establish rules for the global marketplace that allow people to have confidence. One reason why people deal in markets is because they have confidence that their intellectual property and their property rights will be protected. If you don't believe that your property rights will be protected in a particular country, well, then you're probably not going to do business in that country because it's too great a risk. Well, the more international market organizations there are to try to enforce the rules and to try to make sure everybody gets protected, the more likely businesses are to join and do business in other countries. Here are some examples that we discussed before. You have the World Trade Organization that makes sure that states adhere to the rules laid down by treaties signed by the World Trade Organization and tries to promote low barriers to trade and investment. In the old days, many countries, and still to some extent they do, but not as much, had tariffs and taxes on imported goods that made it almost impossible for companies to be profitable and successful in importing goods. Well, the World Trade Organization tries to mediate disputes and tries to make sure that countries don't prevent each other from importing goods into their country. WTO has 148 members, which accounts for 97% of world trade. So the WTO certainly has a lot of power in terms of making sure that goods can be moved from country to country. Here, for example, is the World Trade Organization webpage. Look at some of the stories they're dealing with over here. Tobacco packaging, well, okay, this finds pretty quickly, but you can see how the WTO, just by a synopsis of these stories, look at this. EU files dispute against Russia over tariffs of agricultural and, there's a dispute over tariffs, and you can see the various stories they're following here. But the idea is that the WTO seeks to try to mediate disputes between countries and do whatever's necessary to try to figure out a way to make countries able to deal with each other. Here's the thing about the Russian dispute. The EU files a lawsuit against Russia over tariffs of agricultural and manufactured goods. So that's part of the function of the WTO to try to settle these kinds of issues. There's the International Monetary Fund to lend money to countries in crisis. Greece a few years ago, Mexico, Russia, South Korea, and some other countries that have had budgetary problems. Then there's the United Nations. That has a lot of functions, but one of them is to try to maintain international peace and security and to try to develop friendly relations among nations. Then there was the World Bank, which promotes economic development with low-interest loans for infrastructure projects in various countries. And that's an example of the World Bank is not like the Federal Reserve, which can actually make decisions on currency and make decisions on interest rates. So it doesn't have as much power as individual nation banks. But look, this is the World Bank's web page. Here's just an example of what's going on today: $100 million to speed healthcare workers to countries with Ebola. and other issues regarding Dubai's private education. In other words, things that are relevant to infrastructure to try to help countries as they develop and as they move along. Here are also and then there's another thing that we're going to discuss where you have this trade-off, this tension between business power and government power. And international trade and international business in general, whenever you're dealing with that, you have to look at, okay, to what extent are you going to let private companies do pretty much what they like in terms of outsourcing, in terms of trade, and to what extent are the governments themselves going to be the policymakers? Here are some examples. Today's economy is becoming increasingly interdependent for businesses, for individual businesses who decide essentially where to go with their business and what to do with their business. And the global economy is shifting power away from the governments and putting towards international organizations. The WTO and the IMF and those organizations, even though certainly the countries have a role in running it, especially the IMF, but it's primarily a private enterprise issue where businesses can decide whether and how to cooperate with other countries and with businesses in other countries. And because of that, governments can take the position that bureaucrats controlling these international trade policies may impose policies on individual countries, which undermines the sovereignty of those countries. If big American corporations, do business in countries like, let's say, Greece and Spain and Japan, Indonesia, well, the countries may get the sense that this is kind of undermining their authority, that the American corporations are able to make economic rules by virtue of the fact that the companies within those countries want to do business. So, on the other hand, there's the option to allow more government control. And again, neither of these are correct or incorrect, and neither of these are necessarily happening to a full extent, but these are all issues that come up. Many economists and politicians believe that the power of organizations is limited to what the nations collectively agree to grant. In other words, is this the sort of thing that countries ought to be able to control? Should countries ought to be able to stop imports and exports if it's best for the people in their own country? And international organizations serve to exist the collective interests. And so again, this is the tension. The tension is, do you want to allow the private enterprise and the business to control international trade, or to allow the individual governments to do, what's in the interest of each individual country? Those are the sorts of things that we're also going to cover over the course of this course. Chapter 2 is really about, or Lesson 2 is really about the reason for the global economy and the reason for the globalization and the reason why this course is even necessary, and that's technology. Advances in communication, information processing, and transportation technology have enabled, of course, much more globalization. If you can't easily speak to other people in other countries, if you can't easily get there with improved and cheaper airplane transportation, and of course information and processing so that you can make sure to have a good view and a good grasp on what's happening in your business in other countries. Or of course these are the things that make globalization possible. Changes in technology, of course, include microprocessors and telecommunications, which are computers, and making sure that computers are much more powerful, and telephones where you can communicate with people on Skype for free, and something that even 10, 15 years ago would have been considered utterly impossible. The Internet and the World Wide Web have allowed companies to expand their global presence and to communicate and find out information in a way that's much cheaper and much faster than ever possible. And of course, transportation technology. It hasn't increased as fast or as much as information technology, but it certainly has increased dramatically. So let's look at how this intersects with political systems. Political systems is the system of government of a nation. And it also looks at the political systems are going to be important when making a determination of what kind of business you can do in a country. A country could have really good natural resources and could have a lot of labor that's very cheap and very efficient. But on the other hand, if the government is not going to allow you to operate freely in that country, then all of that is pretty useless. And therefore, a political system is assessed according to the degree to which a country is democratic or totalitarian. Democratic countries tend to allow businesses to operate in a much more free market system. The degree to which the country emphasizes collectivism or individualism. Collectivism means the overall goals rather than the individual goals, and individualism means freedom of the individual rather than freedom of the group. A communism, socialism type government focuses more on collectivism, whereas a free market economy, capitalist government, looks at more like of individualism. Individualism is where the government says pretty much everybody pretty much do what you like, and we'll make reasonable restrictions, but if you make money, that's your affair. Whereas socialism is essentially everybody ought to have approximately the same opportunity, and the government should make sure that people aren't too rich and aren't too poor. And again, it's a little more complicated than that. But when doing business in a state, you want to know whether the government is going to interfere with your ability to profit from that business. So that's certainly an important factor. A political economy is really a subset of the political system, which is how political, legal, and economic systems are interdependent with each other. How much does a government control the economy of a particular country? The more a government controls the economy and the more regulations there are, the more careful and the more wary you have to be about doing business within that country. How much is government regulation going to interfere with your ability to do well in that country? Another thing you have to look at is the legal system. What is the court system? What are the rules? How many rules are there that regulate business? What are specific things that you have to worry about? Are you going to be subject to lawsuits, for example, that are filed in that country? What do you need to do to protect yourself against them? Do you need to hire a lawyer who's familiar with that system? The legal system are rules that regulate behavior and the process by which the laws are enforced and which compensation is given out. You have to look at the court system in terms of the civil court system. Lawsuits, how are lawsuits handled? How big are lawsuit damages? Is it the sort of thing where going into a country, even though you may make profit on manufacturing, is simply too risky because your employees could sue you for unsafe working conditions or poor working conditions to the point where you're not going to be able to make a profit? These are things, before you do business in other countries, you have to take all of these things into account. Of course, the legal system is influenced by the prevailing political system. Countries that are more socialist tend to take workers' rights more seriously. Countries that are more capitalist tend to allow companies greater freedom. And also, this is true for the legal systems in terms of how they apply to businesses. How are business transactions executed and carried out? How are business practices regulated? Can you have somebody work for 14 hours a day on your assembly line for $5 an hour? Or are you limited to having people work for 7 hours a day, and do you have to pay them $15 an hour? There are different countries that have higher or lower minimum wages, higher or lower working hours, working conditions, union benefits, retirement benefits. All these things, in terms of how a country operates, are the sorts of things you have to determine when you're in the U.S. You have to know American law, but when you branch out and do business with other countries, you need to know these things about how those other countries are run. Legal systems in general are based on common law, which means tradition of really case law. This is really true in Britain and also the United States to some extent, where not everything is necessarily written into law, but it's based on cases, based on examples, based on historical examples. For example, in the United States, contract law is not so much based on specific laws that are written down, but more based on tradition. How you form a contract, offer, acceptance, consideration, legal subject matter, defenses like coercion, things like that, are really based on cases and court cases that have made decisions in similar cases in the past. Well, That is a common law system. A civil law system is based on a very detailed set of laws, and theocratic law means countries that are based on religious doctrine. Now, of course, most countries that we deal with are some sort of a combination between common law and civil law. In the United States, we've got lots of case law, but we also have statutes. We also have written laws. Same thing is true as most European countries. Countries like Britain and the United States tend to lean a little bit more towards common law, but countries in the European heartland tend to lean a little bit more towards civil law, but you're going to find some sort of a combination. In some countries, like Iran, for example, some Middle Eastern countries, you got to look at theocracy, you got to look at religious law, and things are going to be based on religious law. Certain types of contracts that charge interest, for example, might not be allowed. That's the sort of thing you have to take into account before you go into that kind of country. Contract law is, of course, probably the first thing that you have to look at whenever you're talking about doing business with international firms, because you're going to want to make an agreement with them to import or export your goods, produce your goods, sell your goods. You need to be able to enforce a contract. If you can't enforce an agreement with someone, well, then there's kind of no point in making that agreement. So what a contract is, it's a document that specifies the conditions under which any exchange will occur. It doesn't have to be an exchange of goods or money. It could be an exchange of products or intellectual property or pretty much everything. And it provides the rights and obligations of the parties. And contract law means the law that governs contract enforcement. On common law systems, like Britain and the United States, where things are based on case law, contracts tend to be very detailed, and the reason is because the codes don't specify what the contracts have to say, so you want to apply for every contingency. Civil law system, countries like Germany and Middle European countries, France, the contracts may not have to be as long because the default rules, the rules for the contracts themselves, are spread out in much more detail in the statutes, in the country's laws. But still, that doesn't mean that you're not going to have complex contract with German or French companies. It just means that it's usually a little bit less necessary than when you're talking about British or American contracts. And contracts, of course, are used to enforce laws between different legal systems. Certainly, you would never want to deal with anyone in a country whose country will not enforce contracts at all. By definition, that would be bad for your business. International contracts are governed primarily by contracts for the international sale of goods. Now, this, of course, only applies to sales of goods. Sales of goods means sales of physical objects. It doesn't apply, for example, to intellectual property for the selling of patents or selling of copyrights. But it does apply to selling of cars or toys or pretty much any physical objects. And this the contract for the international sale of goods establishes a uniform set of rules, a common set of rules, that governs certain aspects of and performance of everyday contracts. And countries, which about 70 countries have done, have adopted this. Of course, this contract, this convention, is not binding unless the country actually adopts it. And fortunately, about 70 countries have. Most larger countries have done so, and in that way, a nation can signal that it will treat the convention rules as part of its law. However, some countries, like Japan and the United Kingdom, have not agreed to the provisions of the contract for the sale of goods, for the international sale of goods. That doesn't mean that those countries don't have their own contract systems. They do, of course. You can definitely do business with British companies and Japanese companies, but you have to realize that you may have to look at their codes. If you want to enforce something against a Japanese company, you might have to, be very careful that you're going to be able to enforce it under Japanese law. You're not necessarily going to be able to enforce it under the international sale of goods contract or convention. And finally, the other issue, and really this is kind of a segue into the next chapter, is the idea of individualism, which governs also how countries tend to look at business and contract law in general. Individualism is a philosophy that the individual should have freedom over his or her own political or economic pursuits. It dates all the way back to Aristotle, but the effect, again, that's not really, there are other economists over here, David Hume, certainly Adam Smith, who was, maybe the father of capitalism, so to speak. Milton Friedman, who was a famous Nobel Prize winning professor in the University of Chicago. He was a free market capitalist. Free market capitalism generally is based on this idea of individualism, where individuals should pretty much be free to do what they like and in business, with restraints being only as minimal as possible. And the way this applies to economics is that individual economic and political freedoms are the ground rules on which society should be based. At least that's according to the theory of individualism. And it dictates this theory of individualism for those that believe in it, and primarily the United States does believe in it, at least to some extent, governs the idea that people should be able to be free to run their businesses pretty much how they see fit. And that brings us to culture, which is, of course, a very important thing that you have to realize whenever you go into a country. Whenever you go in and do business in a country, you have to take account into that culture. It's one thing to take into account that country's legal and economic system, which you have to do, obviously, but it's another thing to realize that the sorts of agreements and the sorts of procedures that work in your country are not necessarily going to work in every other country. Some countries believe in working harder. Some countries believe in working less hard. Some countries believe in workers' rights. Some countries believe in satisfying the consumer to any extent possible. And some countries believe that consumers ought to bend their will a little bit. Culture is a system of values or norms that's shared among a group of people. Doesn't mean that everybody believes in the same culture. Certainly in the United States there are many different cultures that blend, but there still are basic national cultures that you have to take into account, things that are fairly consistent across the board in many countries. Values and norms are aspects of culture. Values are ideas that people believe to be good, right, and desirable. What do we consider good, right, and desirable? Maybe hard work, education, helping other people. Other countries may consider the wealth of their leaders to be their most important thing, or the honor, being able to be very good in combat. I mean, who knows what different cultures around the world have as their primary values, but certainly that's something you need to watch out for. Are you selling a product in countries that don't believe that people, are you selling a luxury product in a country that doesn't consider luxury to be a positive value? That's the sort of thing you need to take into account. A norm are social rules and guidelines that prescribe appropriate behavior in particular situations, similar to a value, but value is more like a moral judgment. Norm is what people generally believe in a society, in a group, and a society is a group of people that share a common set of values and norms. Doesn't mean everybody believes in them to the same extent, but we have a society that has certain norms in that most people believe in certain basic tenets in our society. The value of hard work, the value of production, the praiseworthiness of entrepreneurialism, gender equality, racial equality. These are some of the things that are part of American culture. The entertainment, athleticism, sporting events, whatever. I mean, other countries may just prescribe less significance to these sorts of things and more significance to other things that we don't really care that much about. Culture, of course, is influenced by many things. Social structure. There are people that are higher on the hog, so to speak, considered to be more important than people that are lower in terms of wealth and in terms of influence. Language, education, economic philosophy, individualism versus collectivism. Political philosophy. Do you believe in totalitarianism and rule, monarchy, having a single ruler or a group of ruler, oligarchy? Or do you believe in democracy? And of course, religion is a big impact on the culture of a country or the culture of a group of people. Another thing that influences culture is, of course, education. Formal education is a way most people learn the language, mathematical skills, concepts, things like that, and it's very important in determining a nation's competitive advantage. Countries that produce people who are very good at science and math tend to do well when it comes to technology, when it comes to developing new patentable ideas. Education is certainly linked to economic success because the availability of skilled and educated workers is a major determinant in the likely economic success of a country. If the country doesn't produce an educated workforce, then they're going to be good for manufacturing perhaps, but they're probably not going to be good for entrepreneurialism. They're not going to be good for economic development. They're not going to be good necessarily for things that make countries very powerful. So a good education system is an important factor. If you're outsourcing something that takes brains to a country, you want to make sure that that country has the economic system to produce people that are going to have the brains to fulfill whatever it is you need them to fulfill. And the general education levels tell you what kind of promotional material should be used also. Countries that are more educated, maybe you have to be more sophisticated in your advertising. Countries, cities, areas that are less educated, maybe you have to appeal to their base instinct and not worry so much about, about being complex and being in depth. Now, people sometimes confuse a society with a country, and that's something that we need to ensure that we don't look at necessarily. Just because you're one country doesn't mean necessarily you're one society. I mean, in the United States, for example, with 315 million people, it's one country, but you have to look at the societal factors that are different in different regions. People in Massachusetts may have to be dealt with slightly differently than people in Mississippi. In other countries, the same thing is true. In China, there's almost 1.5 billion people. You can't treat the entire Chinese people the exact same way. On the other hand, there could be societies that include multiple countries. There are small countries in Southeast Europe that you can pretty much put together when you look at the values they hold. There may be very small countries that are grouped together. So it's not a strictly one-to-one thing, because a nation is a political creation and function of the government, where a society is a group of people that live and think in a similar vein. So a national culture is a mix of many subcultures. So a culture can be part of one or more countries, and a country can be part of many countries can be part of one culture. And many cultures can be in one country. You have to look at things, at areas on an individual basis, even within countries. And then, of course, we have religion. Religion and ethical systems. An ethical system is a set of moral principles that shapes the behavior of a particular group of people. And a religion is, of course, well, we all know, a group of faith principles that shape the culture of a country. The four dominant religions today, you have Christianity in the West generally, Islam in the Middle East, and in parts of Asia as well, and parts of Europe. Hinduism, which is primarily in India, and Buddhism, which is primarily in China and other areas in Asia. And the relationships, there are relationships between religion, ethics, and society. Those are three different aspects that we've discussed. The religion that dictates what people think and how people think. The ethics that are believed, the value system within each country. Then there's the society itself, what the people enjoy, what the people like, what the people believe, what the people think they need, what the people do need. So these are all things that are slightly different concepts from each other, although they're all interwoven into the calculation that you need to make when doing business in a country. You need to take all these three things into account. It's important to use cautions about generalization among societies just based on their religion or without taking into account these other factors. Ethics and business ethics is a very important component of international business. I know I say every chapter is important, well, because every chapter is important, but ethics is the sort of thing that, you may not necessarily be enforced by the courts, but it is the sort of thing that can be enforced by the courts, but also can get you a bad reputation if you don't follow it, and also could cause other sorts of problems. Ethics in general means accepted principles of right or wrong that govern the conduct of a person, profession, organization, group, whatever. Business ethics, of course, applies to business people. And an ethical strategy is a strategy that complies with the accepted principles that we're dealing with over here. So running an ethical business in general of course, it helps when it comes to improving your reputation, making sure people deal with you, etc. Common ethical issues include employment practices. Do you pay your employees well? Do you give them good working conditions? Do you fire them for no reason? These are things that are relevant, of course, to employment practices, and also human rights. How much do you or the countries that you're dealing with interfere with basic human rights? Basic human rights include freedom of speech, assembly, movement, association, who you're dealing with, moving back and forth. These are things that are generally accepted in Western countries as human rights. They're not necessarily, though, taken for granted in other countries. If you have shops in Asia, for example, in Southeast Asia, where people, instead of working for minimum wage, which is $9 or whatever it is, maybe they're paid $9 a day instead of $9 an hour, and maybe they're not given any benefits, health care, anything like that, because they don't have the rules that protect them in those countries. There are also environmental regulations. If you're a chemical company or a company, do you trash the environment, or are you careful to try to make sure that you have the minimum negative effect on the environment possible? Corruption. Do you pay off government bureaucrats in ways that are illegal and immoral? And then you have the issue of the moral obligation of multinational companies. Do companies only owe a responsibility to their shareholders to try to make as much a profit as possible? Or do they also owe a responsibility to the people, to the societies in which they are, to have higher wages, to promote products that will help people? Which one? That's an important ethical conundrum. Do you maximize the profits for your shareholders, or do you also try to maximize the convenience for your customers and the benefits for the areas in which you work? Law was passed in 1977 called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is a guiding instrument for people who are doing business overseas. And the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is trying to at least export some of our ideas of morality for when people in the United States deal with countries who may not have the same kinds of laws as Western countries do. And it outlaws the paying of bribes to foreign governments to gain business. And it was amended, which means, of course, changed, to facilitate payments and enabling companies to make payments that to attain the standard of business necessary from a government. Basically, long story short, we're not going to go into the specifics. Obviously, this is a survey course. We're not going to go into the specifics of all these rules that we're discussing, but it limits the ability to bribe another government to give you a contract that would be unfair under the American system. Now, of course, those countries may not enforce it, but if you're an American company and you have an American bank account and you're an American citizen, you're bound by American law even when doing business overseas. And the purpose of the law is to protect businesses, but also trying to stop corrupt businesses from acting that way in foreign countries. An ethical dilemma is where you're not sure what the ethics of a particular situation would be. Maybe there are countervailing ethical considerations. Maybe there's one consideration that would indicate doing one thing and another consideration that would indicate something else, and so therefore which can be complex. That's a situation in which none of the alternatives seem acceptable. These issues can be complex, difficult to frame, or other consequences that could be hard to quantify. For example, if paying everybody a minimum wage means that you have to fire some people because you're not going to have enough money, so what's the ethical thing to do? Is the ethical thing to fire 50 people from your staff in order to pay the rest of them more money and give them a living wage? Or is the ethical thing to maintain everybody on your staff, and even if they're getting less money than they otherwise would, but at least they're able to live? I mean, that's the sort of thing where you have a dilemma. Is it ethical to illegally bribe certain officials, but for the purpose of maintaining the benefits of your workers? Is that ethical? Is it ethical to give illegal bribes, but for to improve human rights? I mean, these are all things that are dilemmas, and the sorts of things that international businesses that run factories overseas have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Managers need a moral compass to guide them to an acceptable solution. And the ethical obligations are not always clear-cut. Employment conditions, human rights, and corruption, bribing a foreign country to improve the status of your employees, environmental pollution, do you hurt your employees by giving them less of a salary because you need to remediate the environment, because you need to spend some of that money to clean up some of the environment? Who do you put ahead? Do you put the environment ahead of your employees, or do you put the employees ahead of the environment? These, of course, are not easy questions at all. And the use of power, of course, is another issue. How do you use the power? When is it justified to use power to control people, but in a way that's going to help you and your company and your employees? When is that ethical? There are many reasons why people behave in a way that is unethical. One reason is because it's different than personal ethics. A person may have a personal set of ethics, but not believe that implies, or that applies to their business. You wouldn't perhaps bribe someone on a personal level, but maybe your business, since you're doing it on behalf of your employees, maybe you think that that's okay. Maybe some business people don't believe that they're behaving unethical because they simply don't think about it, or they don't question it, or because everybody does it. Or the organization itself may not emphasize ethics. The business may simply focus on the economic outcome and may tell the people who are in charge of these decisions that the only thing that they need to consider are things that are going to make the company money, and they should not consider ethical issues. Some companies do that, unfortunately, which of course causes the people making the decisions to not worry about ethical issues. Other things include unrealistic performance expectations. Sometimes the people who are your supervisor require you to make 12,000 widgets in a month, and in order to do that, you have to hire people who are underage, you have to make people work longer hours than they otherwise would, you have to make the product a little bit less quality, you have to cut corners in terms of quality control in order to manufacture them very quickly. Unethical leadership. When leaders set an example by behaving unethically, their subordinates tend to follow suit. And finally, you have societal issues. Maybe their individualism in that culture is so strong, and the idea of the profit motive in capitalism is so strong in an area, that it almost discourages using ethics as a reason to decrease your economic output. Maybe the culture believes so strongly in making money that ethics take a back seat. And also, firms that have headquarters in cultures where masculinity and power rank high are less likely to stress ethical behavior. The gung-ho power structure may not worry so much about whether things are being done ethically. And that brings us to the question of social responsibility. Again, as I said before, it's not clear that businesses have social responsibility, which is one reason socialists and people who are not capitalists argue against capitalism. That's one big argument against capitalism. The idea that corporations don't have social responsibility, so if we allow them to behave however they like, they're naturally not going to behave ethically and naturally not going to be socially responsible. Social responsibility means considering consequences that are not simply based on profits. Considering consequences of society. Is it going to improve the lot of the people that are working for you or the people in the neighborhood? And that there should be assumption in favor of decisions that have good economic and social consequences. That's the idea of social responsibility, and that means benevolent, which means nice and pleasant or behavior that helps people. And that's really the question of, should there be social responsibility? Should businesses behave socially responsible, or should they only be worried specifically about the profit? That's, of course, a very important ethical decision that all businesses have to make. Obviously, sometimes social responsibility could also be good for your bottom line, because it doesn't get you in trouble and because it improves your reputation. But when the two things conflict, it becomes very complex whether a manager, especially working in a foreign country that doesn't have the same kind of consumer protection rules as we do here, should they worry about being socially responsible or just worry about making money? Lesson 5 is about one of our more complex and longer areas. That is international trade theory. A little bit more esoteric, but the idea why international trade is so important and what are the sorts of things that are most conducive to international trade. International trade includes the exchange of capital, goods, and services across international borders and territories. Capital might mean investment projects. Chiefly, you're talking about money when you talk about capital, but it also means services. Lawyers helping people from Europe get patents in the United States, uh, goods, physical objects, cars being shipped across the ocean, etc. In most countries, such trade represents a significant share of the gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is a method of measuring how large your economy is. And stuff that you import, stuff that you export, goods and services that you provide and get from other countries is a significant share of your economy. And that's why it's beneficial for countries to engage in international trade, even for product that's able to produce itself. For example, we produce oil, but we also import oil. We produce toys, but we also import toys. There are various theories and various reasons why it might pay to import stuff, even though you can produce it yourself. Free trade in general, which is the next thing, which is really the hallmark of international business, is the method by which, or the phenomenon by which people can freely trade with other countries without government interference. This is when the government does not attempt to influence what its citizens can buy from another country and what its citizens can produce and sell to another country. Now, no country has entirely free trade, and very few countries have no free trade. Maybe North Korea maybe has no free trade, but for all intents and purposes, most countries are some sort of a hybrid. You can trade things with other countries, but the government has certain rules and regulations in how it works. So influence of the government is through quotas or duties, including tariffs, which are taxes on imports and exports, and in some ways requiring that things be imported or exported, or that things not be imported and exported. If there's a disease, for example, there were, during the mad cow disease scare a few years back, for a little while, the United States stores, the United States consumers were not allowed to import British beef because of the fear that there was going to be that they were going to be afflicted, or I don't know whether it was mad cow disease or foot and mouth disease or something like, or foot and hand, I don't know. Anyway, there were, if for Ebola also, for example, for a little while, if a country says you're not allowed to have any flights from West Africa, that of course is also a limitation on free trade that the government sometimes does because it deems it necessary, whether temporarily or permanent in some cases. There are, of course, a lot of benefits of free trade, which, first of all, a country's economy may gain if its citizens buy certain products. They could be made cheaper in other countries, they could be made better in other countries, and they could free people up for doing things that are more valuable. If a country makes textiles elsewhere, well, maybe those some workers who otherwise would be making the textiles would be free to be the historians or the doctors or the lawyers. So that allows a country to specialize in the manufacture of export of products that it can do efficiently, and import things that can be done more efficiently in other countries. Again, import your oil, import your textiles, but export your intellectual property, export your computer software, export things that you can make best, whereas import things that others can make best and cheapest and most efficient. The idea of free trade leads to a concept that isn't quite as relevant today, but it's a concept that played a central component, by the way, in the American Revolution and in that era, called mercantilism. Mercantilism, it was a theory that the country's best interest was to maintain a trade surplus, which means to export more than import. Now, we, for example, in the United States, don't worry so much about having a trade surplus. It's been many years since we've had a trade surplus. We import a lot more than we export, but that's just the way our economy works. Now, the problem with mercantilism is that it views trade as a zero-sum game, which if you import, that means obviously if you import, somebody else is exporting, but it's not necessarily only a good thing to export, and it's not necessarily only a bad thing to import stuff. So mercantilism, one of the communist criticisms of capitalism was that people were constantly trying to export, 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 and therefore they had to go out and fight with each other in order to determine who was going to export what into which country. That's the idea of mercantilism, trying to free up foreign markets for your stuff while not importing as much of their stuff. Obviously, the more you export, the more money you can make, and that could be a good thing for the economy, but it could also be a good thing to import things when you need to import them. And one of the things free trade is based on is the product lifestyle theory. That is, that as products mature, the location of the optimal production will change. Maybe certain computer products at the very beginning, when you're still developing it, maybe the best place to make it is in the place that they're invented, in your garage or in your hometown. And then eventually, when it becomes easier to make, maybe the best place to make it is in China or Taiwan. As products become, as the technology changes in terms of how products are developed, the best place to change it, the best place to manufacture it can change. For example, the size and wealth of the U.S. market gave the U.S. firms a strong incentive to develop new products. And the product would initially, take, the iPhone, for example, or take, the smartphone, tablets, computers, high technology things. That's really what we consider the highest technology things in today's day and age. So let's take that as an example. Initially, the product would be produced and sold in the U.S., and then, as the demand grew, we would send it to other countries as well. People from other countries want iPads and iPhones and things like that. And then, eventually, rather than producing it in California and shipping it to China, we could produce it in China, produce it in Taiwan, and then maybe even produce it in Taiwan and ship it back to the United States. That's all part of the product cycle, the product life cycle theory, where products can change in terms of the optimal and the best place to develop them. And a couple of subsets of the product cycle theory is that as the markets in the US and other advanced nations matured, the products would become more standardized and the price would be the main competitive weapon. In other words, when an iPhone is brand new, well then people will buy it at pretty much any price if they really want it. On the other hand, once a product gets to a mature stage, well then other people are developing, there's a lot of competition, there becomes a premium on developing it and being able to sell it for a very cheap price. So producers based in advanced countries where labor costs were lower might be able to export to the United States, producing tablets instead of producing them in California, producing them in Taiwan. And if cost pressures were intense, the developing countries would require a production advantage. It costs a lot less money to produce something in China than it does to the United States because the workers get paid less. Their currency is worth less. And it becomes a lot easier for them to develop. And therefore, production becomes concentrated in lower locations and the U.S. becomes an importer. So whereas the U.S. originally might have been an exporter for a tablet or a smartphone or a computer, then eventually it becomes an importer because countries in which it can be produced can produce it for cheaper. Here's a little graph over here where you would look at the United States on top and developing countries like China on the bottom, where the United States at first would produce these high technology products like phones and iPads and whatnot, and as our consumption would grow, eventually we wouldn't produce as many because more of it would be produced in third world countries, in countries like China, and so therefore we would eventually stop producing as much, and as our demand rises, we'd have to actually start importing. Whereas in countries like China, at the beginning, even though their consumption is low, they weren't producing a lot of it. Eventually, they would produce enough to become exporters of those things. Now, next we go to some, ideas that are either critical or a little bit different than the product life cycle theory. Historically, the life cycle product accurately explains international trade patterns for high technology products. Products that initially could only be produced where they were invented, but eventually were able to be produced in developing countries as well. The globalization and the integration of the world economy, however, because everything is so integrated between different countries, has made it a little bit less valid today. From an Asian or European perspective, the theory is a little ethnocentric, because of the idea that products are in fact not always introduced first in individual country. Products very often are produced first in many different countries, or even in developing countries. So therefore, while it's useful maybe to explain how things used to go, because production, especially of smartphones, tablets, even though what I was discussing, they're not just developed in California. They're also developed in Norway and in Sweden and in Japan and in China and these other places, and therefore the product life cycle theory doesn't quite have as much relevance as it once did. One more theory that's relevant to international trade is the quote-unquote Porter's diamond, which is a theory suggested by Michael Porter. I'm going to show you the diagram first, which is the next slide. In fact, I'll move this slide up over here. Really, it says that there are four basic factors that determine whether a country is going to be successful at trade. In other words, exporting products that they need to export particularly. Strategy, structure, and rivalry within the different companies. Conditions of demand, which is, which products are in demand by people. Factor endowments, which is what resources countries have that allow the product to be successful, and related and supporting industries. Let's look at these one at a time. Factor endowments means a position in factors of production. In other words, what does the country have in terms of human resources, natural resources, and things like that that allow the product to be produced. Things like natural resources, climate, and location. If you're talking about agricultural goods, if you're talking about coffee or citrus fruits, well, you need to have the weather in which you can grow coffee and citrus fruits. Factors can also be more advanced. Skilled labor factors, could be more advanced, like skilled labor, infrastructure, technological know-how, education level of the workers. All of these things could go into the structure that allows these products to be produced. Related and supporting industries. In other words, what other industries are relevant to it? If you're producing cars, so maybe a steel producing industry, a tire industry, car repair industry are all important that allows you to be successful in producing and marketing these products. Demand condition, which is the nature of the country for the industry's product or service, and the nation's firms get competitive advantage if their domestic consumers are sophisticated and demanding, so that they produce things that other people in the world will also want. A car industry, for example, in the United States, well, the United States people like big cars and they like nice cars and fancy cars. That could help American car manufacturers because they're used to producing cars that the market likes. Finally, firm strategy, structure, and rivalry, which are conditions governing how companies are created, organized, and managed. How is there vigorous domestic rivalry? Is there vigorous domestic competition? If there is, between General Motors and Chrysler and Ford, or between Apple and Google and Microsoft, that causes innovation, that causes an increase. If you look at Japan, for example, between Nissan and Honda and Toyota, the vigorous competition in their internal market also helps them produce products that are going to appeal to consumers in other countries. Whereas if countries are really dominated by one company, that company doesn't really have the incentive to innovate because it can dominate its home market anyway. Government intervention, of course, is a very big part of international business. Wherever you do business, you have to make sure that the governments of your country and the country with whom you are doing business, of the government of the country that is home to the company that you're doing business with, are going to be amenable to whatever plans and are going to allow you to do what you need to do to make the deal a success. Governments do interfere with free trade, and interfere with trade in many different ways, including tariffs. Tariffs are taxes that are levied on imports, which raises the cost of imported products. For example, if you're a country like Japan, for example, which I don't know if they still do it, but I know they used to have tariffs on imported cars. They probably still do. So let's say, for example, they've got a 10% tariff. That means any car that goes into Japan has to pay an extra 10% of its value straight to the government. Now that, of course, raises money for the government, but it also restricts the importation of cars into Japan. Now that, of course, is the intention of a tariff, to try to reduce imports. It also has the negative effect that when the people want to buy the cars, they have to pay more money. It also decreases competition because there aren't as much foreign competition to stimulate the effectiveness of the homegrown industries. So these effectively raise the rates of imported products, increase government revenues. They do force consumers to pay more for certain imports, of course, that's a negative. They are pro-producer. They're anti-consumer. They try to protect the industries of the country, but they're not friendly to the consumer because the consumer has to pay more. And they reduce the overall efficiency of the world economy because now there's not as much competition. Things cannot be moved as easily from country to country, which is why organizations like the WTO don't like tariffs and try to do what they can to avoid it. Some other examples include quotas, which is a restriction on what can be and how many of a particular product can be imported into a country, which can be enforced using licenses. In other words, you only give out a certain number of licenses to import cars or to import computers or to import oil or whatever it is. And these, of course, may limit a firm's ability to serve a country outside itself because there may only be a certain number of tablets that can be imported into Taiwan, for example. So a company looking to export goods into Taiwan needs to make sure that it has the licenses to do what it needs to do. And it hurts consumers with higher prices, but benefits domestic producers very similarly for the same reason as tariffs do it. There's also export restraints, which are quotas imposed by the exporting country. Kind of strange, where countries usually want to export as much as possible so that they can sell to other countries and stimulate their own production. But sometimes producers agree that to export restraints because they don't want the other country, they don't want the home country, they don't want the importing country to restrict them. For example, a country that's afraid that a country might import a tariff might say instead, okay, we'll voluntarily limit exports to your country in exchange for you not imposing tariffs on our inputs. And that also benefits producers and hurts consumers for the same reason. Decreases competition and therefore eventually is going to import price. There's also local content requirements. The government can demand that a specific fraction of a particular type of good or service or industry be produced domestically. And these have the same things. You notice a trend over here with producers with these restrictions. Government restrictions in general tend to increase increase price and therefore hurt the consumer, but they tend to benefit the local producers. So local content requirements do that for the same reason, to make sure that a certain percentage of the product that's used in the country is produced in the country. Again, it decreases competition. And general administrative policies, red tape, the requirement of import licenses, export licenses, fees that are associated with it, transport restrictions, things like that, tend to have the same effects. They hurt consumers. All of these things are government restriction that decrease free trade. And pretty much anything that's going to decrease free trade is going to help the producers in that country, but it's going to hurt the consumers because the prices are going to go up. Then you have kind of the other direction, where rather than hurting other people's imports into the country, governments can help its own industries produce things more efficiently. And one method by which it can do that is with a subsidy. A subsidy is a government payment to a producer. The government says to General Motors, we're going to give you money for producing cars in the United States. This can take the effect of, just cash, here's money, low interest loans, we'll give you the money, it'll lend you the money to stabilize your business, tax breaks, government participation in domestic firms, where the government can actually buy a share of the company. That happened during the bailout with General Motors a few years back. They help producers by helping them compete against low-cost foreign imports. Company that is getting government subsidies to produce things, while they have enough money maybe now to compete with other countries who can produce the same goods with less labor. And it also helps them gain export markets because, again, it helps them produce more goods at a lower price, and maybe they can now start producing in other countries. Companies like Airbus, which is a European airplane manufacturer, they've been known to get subsidies from European governments in order to compete with Boeing, which is the other major airplane manufacturer. And consumers typically absorb the cost of subsidies, well, because the consumers are the ones that are going to be the taxpayers, and the government's going to give stuff away to companies. Well, then the consumers are going to have to pay for it in the long run, because somebody's got to pay for it in the long run, of course. Couple of other, there's the anti-dumping and the dumping. Anti-dumping policies are policies that specifically punish companies that engage in dumping. So let's do dumping first, and then we'll do anti-dumping. Probably dumping should be on top of the slide. In fact, that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to put dumping on top of the slide because you can't really discuss anti-dumping without discussing dumping. Dumping is selling goods in a foreign market below their costs, and even below fair market value. What this does. First of all, if you produce too much to sell in your own country, you might export it to another country just to get rid of it. Even though you're selling it for less than cost, at least you're getting rid of it rather than it just sitting there and not selling at all. And also, what you can do, this is kind of like an antitrust issue, where you use the profits that you make in your own country to allow you to sell them very cheap in another country, and that allows you to hurt that other country's domestic industry. And it allows you, to sell, let's say, for example, iPhones very cheap in a European country, and therefore hurt that country's smartphone industry. And that could eventually allow you to have a monopoly and do well in that country. And anti-dumping policies are policies that punish foreign firms that engage in this sort of thing, which are taxes that specifically target companies that engage in prices that are too low for the purpose of driving out competitors. Lesson 7 is foreign direct investment, which occurs when a firm invests directly in new facilities and to produce or market in a foreign country. In other words, you have a business over here in the United States, and you want to build more cars, you want to build more watches, you want to build more phones, you want to build more whatever, and so you pay to develop a new farm or a new factory or a new group of, a new think tank, whatever it is that you want to build, you build it, you pay to build it in a different country. In other words, you are investing in the infrastructure of the other company, and now your firm is inherently a multinational enterprise. We talked about this in the marketing course, we talked about this in the management course as well. Your firm is now inherently a multinational enterprise because you were in one country, here in the United States, and then you invested directly in another country's infrastructure, and therefore you're involved in two countries. The amount of foreign direct investment are the inflows and the outflows. Outflows are out of the country, and inflows are into a country. If I am investing $1 million of money that was made in the United States in a plant in Canada, well, that is $1 million outflow from the United States of foreign investment, and that is an inflow of $1 million to Canada of foreign investment, of American investment. And foreign direct investment is very often an alternative to exporting. Exporting is when you produce the goods at home and then ship them to another country for sale. I produce the tablets in California and then I ship them to Canada for consumption or for sale. Exports, of course, can be limited by transportation costs and trade barriers. I got to put them on a truck and send them to Canada. Or to give you another example, if I want to send them to China, I got to put them on a boat and send them to China. Cost a lot of money, that sort of infrastructure, that sort of transportation. In addition, there could be trade barriers. The country to which you are sending it, whether it's Canada or China or any other country, may impose tariffs. There may be red tape. There may be various ways in which they can decrease the incentive of people to import into the country. And therefore, foreign direct investment is an alternative. It's a response or an anticipatory response to trade barriers. If I know that going into Canada or going into China, going into Taiwan and shipping goods there is going to cause all sorts of red tape and tariffs to be invoked, well, an alternative might be to set up a factory there. Because if I set up a factory and I build it there, I don't actually have to import it into China. It's already in China when it's manufactured. An alternative to that even is something that's even less than foreign direct investment, and that is licensing. This is where a domestic firm, my company, my car company, General Motors, let's say, or Apple or Google, grants a foreign firm, the licensee, the right to produce and sell the firm's product or to use its production process or to use its brand name. Apple licenses a Chinese company to produce iPhones and put the Apple logo on it. General Motors licenses a Chinese factory or a Japanese factory to produce Chevrolets. They may give them the materials, they may give them trade secrets, they may give them marketing, they may give them whatever needs to be, whatever is relevant to the licensing agreement. But the other company, the Chinese company, the Japanese company, whatever the case may be, is the one that's actually manufacturing and selling the products. And what I do it for, what Apple, what Google, what General Motors does it for, is for royalty. They produce it, they sell it, and we get a percentage. We get 5%, 10%, 20%, whatever it is. Usually that'll be based on what we give them. If we give them both raw materials and know-how, and we send over experts, our royalty might be higher. If the only thing we're giving is the right to stick our logo on their products, well, then the licensing fee is probably going to be a little bit less. That's the royalty fee. The benefit of licensing, of course, the licensee, namely the company or the factory that's being built in China to build these products, is bearing the costs and the risks. And the licensee has the benefit, and that they're getting the brand name. They're getting our know-how. They're getting Apple or Google's logo or know-how or raw materials. They're getting, of course, obviously, each side is only going to do this if it benefits them more than just going out on their own. A similar concept to licensing is franchising. Franchising means you set up a component or a part of a business. Either, you could do domestic franchising, of course, or you could do foreign franchising. It's really for a service industry, and it's the equivalent of licensing. The franchisor and the franchisee make an arrangement where the franchisor sells marketing materials, raw materials, secret recipes, let's say, for a restaurant, secret production techniques for a goods manufacturer, something to that effect. And the franchisee, let's say the Disney World, let's take Euro Disney, the Disney World in Paris or the Disney World in Hong Kong. Well, that was a franchise of the Disney in the United States, and they gave them the intellectual property and the rights to use all Disney trademarks, and they gave them know-how and features of the American Disney museums, but they were franchised. In exchange, they abide to apply by strict rules. The franchisees have to agree to hold up a certain level of standard, otherwise they're going to ruin the name of the franchisor. So the franchising contract specifies the conditions, of course. Franchising is used in many different industries, very, very, very often used in the fast food industry. Things like McDonald's or Starbucks. You go down and there's Starbucks in Europe, Starbucks in Asia, Starbucks in all over the place. Same thing with McDonald's. Reason why you have franchising there, and of course, what McDonald's gives the European or the Asian McDonald's is it gives them recipes and it gives them the name, it gives them the secret ingredients to the secret sauce or whatever they do. The intellectual property, the right to use the M, and for Starbucks, the right to use the Starbucks logo. And in exchange, the other company gives them a certain percentage of the profits, gives them a certain licensing fee, and it also agrees to abide by certain minimum standards to make sure that the Starbucks or McDonald's name doesn't get ruined by poor quality. The reason why this is often used is because fast food can't be exported. You can't make a burger in Kentucky and ship it to Paris and have them eat it there. I mean, I suppose you can, but it really, really would not be very efficient to do it. Fast food know-how is easily transferred. Doesn't take that much of a secret to get people to know how to flip a burger. There's no compelling reason for a firm to have tight control over the franchisees. Brand names are relatively easy to protect. They're associated with these companies, associated with McDonald's, associated with Starbucks. Franchising minimizes the costs, and of course, franchising is more permanent and more lasting than simple licensing agreements. In exchange, the franchisor, or whoever is actually giving the intellectual property, gets either a royalty or a fee. Here's the distinction between a royalty and a fee. Royalty is the remuneration paid to the owners of the technology in exchange for the right to use that technology. You write a book, a publisher may sell it, but you have a royalty of 15% of the proceeds, which means 15% of the sales you get a check for. It's common for a parent company to charge its foreign subsidiaries, like the foreign McDonald's, a royalty in exchange for the use of the technology. Of course, the amount of the royalty can vary from contract to contract. It can be an amount per unit, or it can be a percentage of gross revenues. There's no absolute rule one way or the other. Fees, on the other hand, are compensation for professional service, compensation for goods, compensation for advice. They could be management fees, or they could be technical assistance fees for guidance in how to produce something, guidance in how to run something. So the franchisor can take either one. Usually in franchise arrangements or licensing arrangement, royalties are more common, or you can just pay a flat fee based on the service that's being provided to the franchisee or the licensee, and that would be an example of a fee. Let's go back to direct foreign investment or foreign direct investment. All of these things, by the way, are types of foreign direct investment. You can build a new plant in a different company. You can set up a franchise. You can license a company. All of these are you're giving capital into this new country without actually having to go ahead and export your goods there. So there are some advantages, of course, of foreign direct investment. It could be better strategy than exporting, because you don't have to worry about transportation costs or trade barriers. And in addition, building the factory yourself in that country could have advantages over licensing or franchising, because firms will favor foreign direct investment over licensing, because you maintain control over your operations and your business strategy. The idea is that if you license or franchise a company, yes, they agree to do things a certain way, to do things your way, but you don't have total control over them. On the other hand, if you build the factory and you directly supervise the people and you own the new factory in the Chinese company or in the Canadian factory or in the British factory, in the British Starbucks, let's say, just to give you an idea of the difference. If I own Starbucks, foreign direct investment, I go to London and I buy a place and I set up a Starbucks personally and I own it and I direct it and I manage it. Licensing or franchising would be someone else does it, but I sell them the right to use my name and use my ingredients, use my recipes in exchange for some sort of a fee or a royalty. So if I want more control over the business, then I would choose foreign direct investment over something like licensing or franchising. The idea that foreign direct investment could be superior to franchising or licensing, it's not always the case, but that's based on this idea of internalization theory, which is the idea that if I license someone or I franchise someone and I give them the right to make my Starbucks coffee in their place, and to put my Starbucks logo on it, first of all, I can give away valuable technological know-how. Now, all of a sudden, my franchisees know how to do it. They can go ahead and do it under their own name. Yeah, it may violate my intellectual property, but it may be hard for me to stop. It doesn't give me control over manufacturing, marketing, or any kind of strategy in the foreign country. That's totally up to the franchisee. And also, my advantage that I have at home, the reason why I do so well at home, might be because I'm really good at marketing, or might be because I'm just really good in terms of management. On the other hand, I don't really manage my company. I don't really manage my franchises. The franchises manage themselves. If multiple firms in the same industry invest in other companies, you get a pattern of foreign direct investment, where you have different firms in the same industry do it at the same time in the same location. Let's say General Motors and Ford both open up plants in England at the same time to try to build and sell cars. And what you could have next is sometimes known as a Knickerbocker's theory. The Knickerbocker's theory essentially is that when one member of a group that's dominant in a certain business goes into a different market and opens up a factory or some sort of manufacturing or service provider to another market, the others feel compelled to do the same thing. This is usually in an industry where you only have a few dominant players. One example might be the airline industry. If you have, in the American airline industry, you've got a few dominant players. You've got American Airlines, you've got United Airlines, you've got Delta Airlines, and really a very few others. So now if one, let's say United, goes into Rome Airport and buys out a few gates and starts having travel there, well then Delta and American might feel compelled to do the same thing. And I mean, this really kind of, that this idea of when it's a small industry with only a few players, not a small industry, but only a few players, sometimes known as an oligopoly. Oligopoly means when you only have a few players that run the entire industry or run the entire government or whatever. A monarchy is when you have one leader, an oligarchy is when you have just a few leaders. So an oligopoly is like the American airline industry is probably an oligopoly, where there's only probably 5 or 6 airlines that really run the entire show. And so once one does it, the others go ahead and do that. The oligopolistic industry is where market is controlled by a small number of producers, and then when they go ahead, then others tend to do the same thing, and they compete directly for these foreign markets, because obviously none of these big players wants to be the last to go into a certain market and lose it. Next we turn to Lesson 8, which is regional economic integration. This means essentially when multiple countries get together and decide, we should integrate, which means kind of put together our economies a little bit, in order to make us stronger on the theory that the whole of a group is stronger than the sum of the parts, which is very often true, of course. There have been many examples of economic integration, both that have worked and examples of economic integration that have not worked, and we're going to discuss some of those examples here. So what economic integration means is, again, the unification of policies between different countries. The United States and Canada, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico, the European Union, which we'll discuss, and other such examples. This is done through partial or full lifting of tariffs and non-tariff restrictions on trades, and very often takes place between nations prior to the integration of the entire country. In other words, even if there's no plan for integration of the entire country. Countries like the United States and China, United States and Canada, United States and Mexico, United States and Europe, European countries with each other, these are all examples of countries that have had trade agreements with each other to attempt at least some level of economic integration. There are many different types of economic integration. There's just a little bit of free trade, and then there's much more close economic integration, such as in the case of the European Union. So regional economic integration is with agreements between countries in a geographic region to allow the free flow of goods and services between the countries. Again, the European Union is a classic example. You could also have a regional trade agreement, which is simply where countries maybe don't integrate their economy, but try to reduce barriers between trading with each other. Of course, there are also, unfortunately, some disadvantages with economic integration, and there are really a whole bunch of them. Let's discuss them one at a time. First of all, companies have to capitalize on the opportunities created by the creation of an integrated marketplace. Companies that have previously been, comfortable and doing well in one country maybe may have to adjust to a new economic outlook that's created by the fact that you have multiple countries here. Companies would need to rationalize their production of the products and reduce their cost in order to compete in a combined economy with 2 or more countries in it. The highly competitive business environment will be much greater. There'll be more firms, more companies now from this other country that the country is integrating with that might make it harder for a company to get its goods and services sold. Companies outside of the trading areas may have an even harder time competing. For example, countries in the European Union might integrate with each other, but also may look at outside trading partners, like the United States, Russia, places like that, as kind of being on the outside, not being, within the scope of the economic sphere of prosperity. Firms may also find their choice limited by restrictions on the proposed acquisitions, purchases and mergers. Very often these come with economic integration, where countries have to put restrictions on what individual companies can do in order to make sure that the combination of these countries doesn't hurt them. For example, a company, France might say, for example, well, okay, we'll integrate with Germany, but we want to make sure that French companies aren't hurt, and therefore we will have certain economic protections for French companies. These are things that could work to the disadvantage of individual firms. Here's an example of from the lowest level of free trade agreement in the middle over here, all the way to the highest level of the integration all the way in the out. The lowest level of integration is simply a free trade agreement. We'll trade with you, you trade with us, no tariffs or low tariffs or whatever it is. A customs union, where you're decreasing the restrictions in terms of inspection and in terms of other red tape when you import from one to another. A common market, where you consider both countries, not, the countries are independent certainly, but to be one common market, which certainly allows free trade very smoothly between the two countries. A higher level than that even is an economic union, where basically the entire area is considered one economy, like the European Union. And then you have the political union, where the countries are literally joining together, which is, of course, much more than just an economic union because it applies to the politics and the government as well. Here are some examples of each of these levels. The lowest, which was the free trade area, simply eliminates barriers to trades of goods and services, but each country maintains the right to establish its own policies towards non-members. The North American Free Trade Agreement, the European Free Trade Agreement, this was, of course, before the European Union. These are examples of free trade agreements, but the countries aren't, specifically giving any kind of guarantees or any kind of merger of their economies. Then you have the common market, which has no barriers to trade between member countries and have common external trade policies. An example over here, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay made a South American common market, which not only had free trade between each other, but it also established common policies towards outsiders that would ensure that these outsiders don't, take advantage of any of the countries to the agreement. And it has the free movement of the factors of production. And again, there's no restriction between member nations. Certainly more than a free trade area, but certainly less than a customs union or an economic union. A customs union eliminates trade barriers, and it also adopts a common external trade policy. All the countries get together and say, this is how we are going to deal with foreign countries. OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, might be, kind of an example. Then you have the economic union, which has the free flow of products between members, external trade policy, and a common currency, a tax rate, and monetary policy that's all common to the entire area. The European Union, of course, is really the only example that I can think of offhand as far as that's concerned. The highest level we didn't even get to is a political union, is when two countries merge and come together, like East Germany and West Germany, which is far more even than a political. That's political union over here. That's the next slide over here. Sorry about that. This involves a central political apparatus that coordinates all kinds of policies: economic, social, foreign policy. The United States, within itself, not the United States within any other group, but the 50 United States together have a political union. It's essentially one country. It really is one country. Maybe the 4 countries that are in the United Kingdom: England, Scotland, Wales, and North Ireland. That would be an example of a political union, which is more than just an economic union. An example, of course, of a free trade agreement was the Maastricht Treaty, which was a precursor to the European Union. It was signed in 1991 by the European Council, And it committed the EU to adopt a single currency, which they did by 1999, which of course turned out to be the euro. This created the second largest currency zone in the world after the United States, and it's the currency itself, the euro in other words, is used by 17 out of the 27 countries. Some of the countries decided not to use it. Britain, Denmark, Sweden continued to use their own currency, not necessarily the euro. Many of the countries also locked their exchange rates. Currencies can get worth more and worth less, but these countries were forming an economic union, and so they locked the currencies so that their currencies be worth the same amount relative to each other. For example, France and Germany, the franc and the mark would not go up and down against each other because they agreed essentially to one basic economic policy. And the effects of the European Union included, of course, it created a common market for Europe. It's very easy to import and export goods between Germany, France, and Italy and all the other members of the European Union. Countries within the EU, such as France and Italy, are now much more open to foreign competition from each other. And of course, production can be centralized in the European Union location, where the mix of factor, cost, and skills is optimal. For example, if a French company says, okay, maybe we should go make this in a factory in Greece, it's very easy to do because things can be moved back and forth. The policy is the same, the tax rate is the same. You don't have to worry too much about moving from place to place as you would if they went outside the European Union to produce their goods that way. Production costs and consumer prices should drop, of course, it should cost less to produce a company, for a company that has operations in many of these European Union countries because of the fact that they have one policy. And the creation of the euro has added many benefits. Just one example is Airbus, which is an airplane manufacturer that's competitive with Boeing. I'm not sure if they're as big as Boeing or approximately as big as Boeing, but the fact that they can use essentially the entire Europe as their operations base gives them a little bit of an advantage as opposed to if they had to do operations in France and Germany separately. Another key factor in international business is the foreign exchange market. This is where currencies are swapped with each other. Every country, or most countries, have their own currency. In the United States, it's the dollar. In Canada, it's also the dollar. In Mexico, it's the peso. European Union, of course, has the euro. Israel, it's the shekel. In Japan, it's the yen, etc. Countries all have their own currencies, and these currencies, of course, can be exchanged with each other. And the rate at which they are exchanged with each other is very important. The dollar one day could go up against the Japanese yen, which means a dollar buys more yen than it did yesterday. If it goes down, that means a dollar buys less yen than it did yesterday. And the relative values of the currencies are very important to the various countries' economy. The more money, the more stuff a country's currency buys, the more stuff its people will be able to afford. If the dollar goes up against the euro, that means Americans will be able to buy more European-produced stuff. If the dollar goes down against the euro, it means the Europeans will be able to buy more American stuff with their euro, and Americans will be able to buy less European stuff with their dollars. The importance of the foreign exchange unit, of course, is that it's used to convert the currency of one country into the currency of another, and it provides some insurance against foreign exchange risk. The idea is here, you might want to buy some yen, buy some euros, buy some whatever, even if you deal in dollars on the international exchange, to protect yourself, in case the dollar goes down. There could be unpredictable changes in exchange rates, and that allows you to, in buying some, using your dollars to buy some euros, gives you a little bit of a safety net in case the euro goes up dramatically and the dollar goes down. The exchange rate means the rate at which one currency is converted in another, which, of course, affects things like your sales, profits, and strategy. Dollar goes up, well, now you can produce more stuff, and you can sell. You as an American manufacturer can buy more products in these other countries. Dollar goes down, you have a little bit of a tougher time. But on the other hand, if the dollar goes down, you have the advantage in that it's easier to export stuff to the European Union, because now your stuff is cheaper, so the Europeans may want to import more stuff to the United States. Anyway, so then, of course, that is relevant to the idea of hedging, which is what a firm does to insure itself against the foreign exchange risk. If I have a business that depends on the dollar being high to do well, So on the other hand, I might buy a bunch of euros, so that if the dollar goes down, my business might do well, but at least my euros will go up. That's the idea of hedging. It's a general strategy to minimize your risk a little bit. The foreign exchange market is not in any one particular place. It really, euros and dollars and yen and shekels could be bought online. I mean, there's no inherent place that there are. But of course, the trading centers in the world, the most important trading centers, are in major cities like London, New York, of course, Zurich, Tokyo, Singapore, and some other countries as well. The nature of the foreign market is that it's not like the New York Stock Exchange where there's one particular building. The market is everybody who trades currency. And that's a lot of different types of organizations. Global networks of banks, brokers, exchange dealers, connected by electronic communication systems, connected essentially by the internet and online systems. When companies do wish to convert currencies, they simply go through their own banks or go through their own brokers, and they go ahead and purchase whatever number of currencies you want. I mean, listen, if you're at the airport, you can go to the counter at the airport, which you can convert currency. You're probably not going to get a very good rate. Companies wouldn't go to the airport because in the airport they tend to give you a bad rate and rip you off a little bit. But if it's a small amount, I guess it's not that big a deal. But if it's a big amount, you'll want to take advantage of the exchange a lot more so than just one of these airport shops that convert one currency to another. The foreign market is, of course, growing very strongly because there's a lot of cross-border trade and investment going on. Globalization, as we discussed earlier in the course, and countries relying on each other for trade has been going up dramatically in recent years. Companies themselves also have to use the foreign exchange market in many specific examples. The payments they receive for exports. If you're an American manufacturer and you export goods to Japan, well, the Japanese are going to pay you in yen. Well, you now have to take those yen and you have to convert it into dollars in order to pay your workers, in order to pay yourselves. Income they receive from foreign investments. If you have a Swiss bank account, you may get your interest in francs or in euros. Well, now you have to convert that into dollars if you want to spend it in the United States. Income you receive from licensing agreement from foreign firms. You make a deal with a British agency that they're going to license your product, and they pay you in pounds for that. Well, you have to take those pounds again and convert it into dollars. So again, they pay a foreign company for products and services in that country's currency, or you have spare cash and you want to invest in foreign markets. You could think that the yen is going to go up, or the pound is going to go up, or the euro is going to go up, and the extra dollars you have, you may want to put in a European bank or invest in European currency and see what happens with it. And then there's currency speculation. People literally just buy other currencies, not because they need it for business reasons, but because they think it's going to go up, or they sell it because they think it's going to go down. All of these are aspects of the foreign exchange rates. There's spot exchange and there's forward exchange. The difference is very simple. Spot exchange means you convert it right away. This is the rate at which the foreign exchange dealer converts on a particular day, and this can go up, this can go down. If you go online, for example, I'm looking as of today, right now, $1 US is 80 euro. If I come back tomorrow, you can see the chart over here. Right now, the dollar seems to have been doing pretty well recently against the euro. You see it's gone up from earlier in the year. It was much lower against the euro. Tomorrow, it might be something different. If I change dollar to pound, $1 is 0.63 British pounds sterling. If I go the dollar to yen, it would be $101 US is 114.61. That doesn't mean that the dollar is worth more than the yen, or that the yen is worth less than the euro or the pound, or that the dollar is worth less than the euro or the pound. It's just relative. The number itself doesn't mean anything. The number means something relative to what it was yesterday. And you can see the dollar's gone up a lot against the yen. Back in 2011 it was under 80, 2012 it was under 80, and now it's gone up all the way to 114. Just out of curiosity, what's the shekel today? Okay, $1 is 3.81 new Israeli shekel. You can see the dollar is starting, actually in the last couple of years, the dollar went down a lot against the shekel, but now it's recently started to go back up. So again, and this really changes on a day-to-day basis. That's the spot exchange rate. You can go and you can get basically that rate. I mean, you're not going to get that rate in the airport. You're not going to get $1 for 3.81 shekel. You're going to get a worse rate because they're going to charge you a commission and they're going to try to, rip you off a little bit. But that's the basic exchange rate. Then there's the forward exchange rate, which is where two parties agree to a deal at some point in the future, kind of like an option. 30 days, 90 days, 180 days. This is an example of a hedge where, instead of agreeing to give $1 for 3.81 shekel right now, or $1 for 0.8 euro right now, you agree to give $1 for 0.8 euro 90 days into the future. And this people use as a hedge to make sure that, again, just in case you buy one of these, just in case the dollar goes down against the euro, at least you'll have some euros to try to prevent any kind of major loss. In terms of, now, of course, there are risks in any foreign exchange transaction. There's transaction exposure, which is the extent to which the income from the individual transaction is affected by fluctuations in values. Obligations for purchase or sale of goods. If I commit myself to buy, cars for 10,000 euro each, to buy 25 cars for 10,000 euro each from Germany, well, that's okay. But now imagine if the euro goes up against the dollar, and I'm going to pay for it in 2 months. Now I thought that I was only going to have to pay, let's say, $300,000 for the cars, but instead I'm going to have to pay what amounts to $350,000 for the cars if the dollar has gone down against the euro. In other words, I'm going to have to pay more dollars for the same euro. Services at previously agreed prices. I agreed to give you a service for a certain number of pounds. Well, if the dollar goes down against the pound, then essentially I am getting, in that case, if the dollar goes up against the pound, essentially I'm getting fewer dollars for the service that I provide. Borrowing or lending funds in foreign exchange, same thing. If I have to pay back a certain number of pounds, well, then again, if the dollar goes down, I have to spend more dollars in order to pay back that number of pounds. It's also translation exposure, which is the impact of the currency on the reported financial statements of the company. If you make money, if you're an American company and you have to report money to your shareholders, and you're doing very well and you make profits in your branch in Japan, but then the yen goes down. So if you make a certain profit in yen, well, and then the yen goes down, well, then that number is going to be less. And you may have told your shareholders you're going to make a certain amount, but it turns out your profit is less because of the fact that you're making it in yen and the yen has gone down. These are the sorts of things that just may change. Of course, it can go the other way too. It can go up, which will help. So it can really it's a double-edged sword in this kind of a scenario. It can do well or it can do badly, but that's why it's a risk, of course. There's also economic exposure, which is the exchange rate changing can affect the extent to which a firm's international earning power is affected by changes in exchange rates. I open up a factory in India or China because I assume that I'm going to be able to pay a certain number of workers, and then the Indian currency goes up against the dollar. I'm not able to pay as many workers because I have a certain number of dollars allocated to pay my Indian staff, but now there's been inflation, or the Indian currency, the rupee or whatever it is, goes up, and now I'm not able to pay them with that same number of dollars. I have to use more dollars to pay them, X number of rupees, which is what I promised to pay the employees initially. But of course, the good news is that you have ways of minimizing exposure, kind of decreasing some of these risks. You can buy forward, which means that you can, if you know that you're going to need a certain number of euros on a certain date, well, you can buy the euros as of now, or you can do future exchanges where you're buying the right to get euros at a certain rate 90 days in the future. You can use swaps. In other words, you can trade things which don't require currency to move back and forth. Lead and lag payables and receivables. This is where if you see the currency is going up, you can try to collect things sooner. You can try to delay paying things if the thing that you're paying in goes down, the value goes up. You can try to delay paying until it goes back down. In other words, you can try to adjust the time to give yourself the maximum possible benefit, although that's not always easy to do. You can also distribute productive assets to various locations. Try to scatter it among many different currencies, so that even if one currency goes up and one currency goes down, you're kind of minimizing your risk by diversifying, by going to many different areas, and ensuring that assets are not too concentrated in a particular area that focuses on one currency. Maybe you have one factory in Europe, or one dealing with China, one dealing with India, one dealing with Japan, one dealing with Canada, so that if one particular currency has the issue, you won't suffer too badly. Some other things, you can try to attempt to forecast future exchange rate movements. Not easy to do. If you could do that, you'd be super rich. So theoretically, if you could predict what's going to happen to a foreign currency, you could make money and you could avoid risks. You can establish good reporting systems to try to make sure that, before you do a deal, you analyze at least the risk that is inherent over here based on the foreign exchange rates. You can have central control over exposure. Again, just to try to make sure that your risks are minimized, produce reports, and all these things have to do with giving your company the maximum information that you can to try to make sure that you hedge against whatever risks there are. But risks, of course, are always inherent in the foreign exchange. Continuing our discussion of the last chapter, which is currency exchanges, let's focus a little bit now, in Lesson 10, on the international monetary system, how currencies are traded between countries, and how they together work as an entire system. The international monetary system simply refers to arrangements that countries adopt to govern exchange rates. There are currency exchanges between private companies, private individuals, and governments. How does that work? Who makes the rules? Well, that's what we're going to discuss in this chapter. The four major trading currencies in the world are the dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen, and the British pound. There are fixed exchange rate systems, which are currencies that are fixed against each other. Now, this is not the way it works between the major currencies of the world, but sometimes when countries have close economic cooperation with each other, they do establish that their currencies should not go up or down against each other. For example, prior to the introduction of the euro, many European countries had a fixed rate system, so that, for example, the French franc and the German mark should not go up and down against each other. In other words, if you're not going to use the same currency, but you want to make sure that businesses have a very easy time dealing with each other's countries, you can have a fixed rate system. And if you do that, well, then remember all those risks we discussed. If it goes up and you can't pay your workers in the currency and all those other risks, well, those risks don't apply if two currencies are fixed relative to each other. In other words, if they always have the same value relative to each other. Similar to that is something where the countries are not necessarily cooperating with each other, but one country has a pegged exchange rate system, which is where a country fixes the value of its currency relative to a reference currency. For example, many Gulf states peg their currencies to the US dollar. Argentina pegged its currency to the dollar. The Chinese yuan is not precisely pegged to the dollar, but pretty close. But the idea here is that these countries are established specifically so that their currency should not go up and down against the dollar. Whatever the dollar is worth, if the dollar goes up, then these currencies should go up to follow. That's the idea of a pegged system, where currencies, if they're dealing in dollars a lot, well, they want to make sure that their companies and their governments don't run into these sorts of problems when the dollar goes up and the dollar goes down. And so therefore, they do what they have to do to make sure that their currencies are pegged to the dollar. It's not like a fixed system where two countries are cooperating with each other intentionally, but a pegged system is when a different country says, we're just going to make sure that our currency is worth the same as a dollar. The floating exchange system, which is the more common system, exists where a country allows its currency to determine the relative value of its currency. For example, the dollar and the euro aren't inherently connected to each other. Today, the dollar is worth 0.8 euros. A different day, it might be worth 0.9 euros. A different day, it might be worth 0.7 euros. The point is, it floats, which means it is set by the market. When people want to buy more dollars, the dollar goes up. People want to buy more euros, the euro goes up. And it's kind of like the stock market. That's the general floating exchange rate system, and most currencies float with respect to each other. The dollar could go up against the yen, and it could go down against the euro. It can go up against the shekel. It could go down against the pound. The point is the currencies float with each other. A quote-unquote dirty float is kind of where you have a floating system, but it also has elements of a pegged system. When a country tries to hold its value within some range of the currency, like the Chinese yuan, the Chinese government has been accused by the United States and by other countries of trying to make sure that the yuan doesn't change in value. I mean, the reason for that is actually kind of convoluted. Basically, the reason why the yuan would normally go up dramatically against the dollar, because the Chinese have a tremendous trade imbalance, and the yuan is really worth less than it should be worth, but the Chinese government doesn't want the yuan to go up too much because that will decrease imports from China to the United States. And so the Chinese government does what it can to try to make sure the yuan doesn't go too high up in value, something which the United States very often complains about. Some of the system there, again, so that's similar to a pegged exchange system, but slightly different. Here are some of the differences. A pegged exchange system is when a country fixes or pegs, same thing, its currency to a reference currency. A float is where it doesn't specifically have rules saying it has to be worth the same amount, but it tries to hold the value within some range of the other currency. This is what happens when the central bank of a country, like China, will intervene to try to maintain the value of its currency. If it goes down or up too much, the country will sell or buy enough of its currency to allow its value to kind of be similar to the dollar, for example. The gold standard is something that used to exist in the United States and used to exist in many countries, but doesn't exist anymore, but it's still important, essentially just for you to know what it is. The gold standard is a system which countries peg currencies to gold to make sure that a certain number of dollars always buys a certain amount of gold. Pegged exchange rate systems exist when a country's fixed its value to a particular reference country, or in this case, to a particular reference commodity, namely the gold standard. And the reason this existed is that gold coins used to be a medium of exchange. You know, in the old days, now you have currency specifically backed by a government, but in the old days, in ancient times, people used gold, little nuggets of gold as currency. They had no, value based on some central bank of a country like we have today, but they had inherent value. They were inherently worth something because the gold they were made out of was worth something. And so payments were actually made in gold or silver or whatever precious metal. That's where coins originally came from. Now later this was changed so that people aren't actually paying for things with gold, using paper. They instead use paper money or coins. But these things, when this was first done, the idea was that the paper should be instead of gold. So the gold should always reflect. The paper should money, the dollar, should always reflect a certain amount of gold. And until the 1880s, countries including Germany, Great Britain, United States, etc., followed the gold standard, where $1 was 23.22 grains of gold. In other words, we had to have enough gold to back up every dollar that was printed. There were some advantages. For example, because each system was linked to gold, it was easy to determine of any other currency. Currencies didn't float against each other. And also, it had a balance of equilibrium by all countries. If you had the gold to back it up, you could essentially buy materials, and things were fixed. Now, obviously, the problem with the gold standard, the reason why it was gotten rid of, and the reason why it, isn't, it doesn't apply anymore, is that it really, really restricts the abilities of countries to print more currency and to run up more debt. Because if you have to have a certain amount of gold for every dollar you print, you can't really run up such big deficits. Now, some people will say that's a good idea, but some people will say that limits dramatically the ability of a country to stimulate its own economy by printing the money it needs. In order to facilitate trade between countries, especially with regard to currency, you need a market. And a market of currency is called a capital market, which brings together investors and borrowers. That, of course, in a capital market, you can invest in currencies, but you can also invest in companies, commodities, and other things that people like to invest in. Investors can be corporations that have extra money. They could be individuals, financial institutions, people that want to invest money. And on the other side of the capital market, you have a borrower, somebody who wants the money. And that could be individuals, companies, and governments again. Essentially, a capital market tries to bring together somebody who wants to lend money or give money, buy something, buy a share of a company, buy a share of a currency, buy a commodity, and you have somebody who wants to sell those things. Somebody who wants to get money, somebody who wants to borrow money, something to that effect. And the market makers, in other words, the one who actually sets up the market and runs the market, are the financial service companies. You have that service borrowers directly, those are investment banks, or indirectly, which are commercial banks that give loans to companies. Investment banks are people who actually sell and buy things like currencies and financial products that are relevant to currencies. Capital markets, of course, can be equity, which is what they're selling a percentage of a company, a percentage when you're actually selling something, or debt, when you're just lending money, or selling the ability to borrow money, which is essentially the same thing. All these things are, of course, relevant and part of the capital market structure. Investors have to go through the market makers, and the borrowers eventually get the money. Companies, individuals, institutions that want to lend money or buy shares of companies, things like that, go through the market makers, who are the banks, to give the money to the borrowers. And of course, in exchange, the investors get a right to repayment or some other form of financial reward at the end. Otherwise, obviously, there would be no point in their investing the money in the first place. A euro currency, the next concept, is a little confusing because the euro currency has nothing specifically to do with the euro, as in the European Union. A euro currency refers to any currency banked outside its country of origin. For example, if you have dollars that are banked in a Swiss bank account, or dollars in a Japanese bank account, or pounds in an American bank account, or anything to that effect, that is a euro currency. 2/3 of all euro currencies are US dollars. Many of them in China. U.S. government gives a lot of dollars and gives financial products like bonds, things like that, which are payable in dollars, to Chinese investors, and the Chinese investors put it into their own banks and financial institutions. The euro yen means yen that are banked outside Japan. The euro bound is pound, or there are pounds that are banked outside England, and the euro are euros that are banked outside of the European Union. And of course, it's an important source of low-cost funds for international companies. Companies that are American companies that need to do business in China may need dollars to transact business. Dealing in China with other firms or other people that deal with dollars, they may need to be able to pay dollars from a Chinese bank, and that's why euro currencies are very important. The advantage of having euro currencies in general is, of course, there are a few of them. First of all, it lacks government regulation, which means that euro dollars, for example, that are banked in China aren't specifically governed by the American government. Banks can offer higher interest rates in euro currencies than in deposits made in their home currency. They're not controlled necessarily by the Federal Reserve Bank. They're not controlled by the American banking system because they're not in the United States, even though they are dollars. They are Federal Reserve notes. They are American currency. And the spread between the euro currency deposit rate and the lending rate is less than the spread between domestic deposit and lending rates. In English, that means the transactional costs, the amount that you're going to naturally pay for the cost of keeping the currency, tends to be less outside of its home country. This is a graphic indication of what that means. If you give money into a bank, you're going to get less interest than if you borrow money from a bank. And you can try this. Go down to your local bank and try to open up a savings account. In today's day and age, you'll be lucky if you get, a 0.25% a year. If you borrow, on the other hand, you're going to have to pay a lot more than 0.25%. You're going to have to pay several percent, even if it's backed by a home mortgage, you might have to pay 4.5%, 5%. Certainly, if it's not backed by anything, you're going to have to pay a lot. The lending interest rate is always going to be a lot higher than the borrowing. The rate that the individual is going to have to pay for borrowing is going to be a lot more than the rate that the individual gets by holding money in a checking account or in a CD or in a savings bond. Outside the country, the spread tends to be a little bit less. The deposit rate and the lending rate tend to be a little bit closer together. Some disadvantages of the euro currency market, of trading dollars in China or trading dollars in England or anything to that effect, include, first of all, it's unregulated. If the Chinese bank that holds dollars goes under, well, it's not protected, for example, by the FDIC, by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. When depositors use a regulated banking system, they know that there's a low probability of banking failure. But when you're using an unregulated market, like euro currencies, like Chinese banks holding dollars or American banks holding pounds, they're not as regulated by the governments that establish those currencies, and therefore they're not as safe. They're also exposed to foreign exchange risk. For example, if you are in China dealing with dollars, well, those dollars may not be able to, well, let's take a different example. If you're in Japan using dollars, using a euro currency, well, those dollars, if the yen goes up, may not be able to buy as much Japanese product. Also, minimizing the risk of a euro currency market could be done by accepting a lower return on a home country deposit. In other words, not using euro currency. When you're in Japan doing business, just using American banks, or using foreign forward hedges to lower the risk of foreign exposure. If you're in Japan using dollars, you're using euro currency, but you're worried that the yen might go up, well, then you might buy some yen in order to hedge your bet, so that just in case the yen does go up, at least you're holding enough yen to minimize your loss. Then we've got the foreign bonds. Bonds really are, bonds are really just when any kind of an organization, you lend the organization money in exchange for a certain exchange rate. They're corporate bonds. You give money to Microsoft and they pay you back with a certain interest rate. And there is also government bonds that are established by every country. Now, the United States government sells U.S. savings bond in the United States, but it also sells U.S. savings bonds to other countries. If you want to buy, you can buy British bonds or Israeli bonds or German bonds or, well, Japanese bonds, whatever. These are foreign bonds. They're sold outside the borrower's country and are denominated in the currency of the country in which they are issued. So, for example, the U.S. savings bonds in the U.S. are sold in dollars, whereas U.S. savings bonds in Japan might be sold in yen. Same basic idea. The U.S. government is borrowing money from the Japanese person and promising to pay an interest in exchange. And it's very often used by companies when they think it will reduce the cost of capital to use a foreign bond in order to earn interest. Especially if you're doing business in the United States, you might want to make sure that you get that you get the U.S. savings bonds in order to earn interest in that particular currency. There are some nicknames for bonds: Yankee bonds for U.S. bonds, Samurai bonds for Japan, Bulldogs for Great Britain. Doesn't matter those particular nicknames. The point is these are bonds that are issued outside of the country that is actually issuing them. Lesson 12 is about international business strategy. Now, strategy, of course, is a topic that we also focused on in marketing and the management courses, if you have taken those already. But international business, of course, has a special set of strategies that are important and unique to international business. Generally speaking, a firm strategy is the actions that the managers take to attain the goals of the firm, which is usually to maximize profits. What you want to also, of course, try to do is maximize profitability, but also profit growth. Those two things, profitability is what you make, but also in the percentage of net profits over time. You want to increase the number of dollars you make, but also have a higher percentage of growth. If you make $100,000 one year and you make $110,000 the next year, you've had a 10% profit growth in addition to the $10,000 that you've actually gained. That's your profitability. The value of the firm will increase when profitability and profit growth from year to year are high. When profit growth kind of stagnates, at least you're making a profit. When profit growth falls, well, then you're making less of a profit, and when you have no profit, well, then you have no profit. There are various ways to define each one. You can add value to the firm's products or services to try to increase both profitability and profit growth. You can lower costs, you can sell more, sell in markets, and you can expand internationally. Profitability, which is the raw profit you make, can be increased by reducing your costs and by adding value, raising your prices. If you can get people to buy them, certainly has the effect of increasing your profitability. Profit growth, in other words, you're increasing the amount of profit that you make on a year-to-year basis, could be done by entering new markets or by selling more in your existing markets. Then, of course, really essential to any profitability or increasing profitability is you're creating value. Now, value is the idea that you're creating to your consumers so that your consumers buy your product. Well, really, you need both. You need value to the customer and value to the company. If there's no value to the company, there's no point in selling it. If there's no value to the customer, well, then the customer's not going to buy it. This little simple chart kind of illustrates that. The C is the cost, how much it costs you to produce the product in terms of human resources, manufacturing costs, transportation, whatever. Your P minus C is your profit per unit sold. P is the price minus the cost. So this little area over here, this brown area, is your profit. You make it for $300, you sell it for $500. So your P minus C is 200. Now, the V minus P over here, the tan one, that's the value to the average consumer. What does the consumer value it at? Now, if you have a profit, but the value of the consumer is lower than your price, well, the consumer's not going to buy it. If the value to the consumer is equal to the price, the customer is also not going to buy it, because then the customer is breaking even. The customer will buy something if it's worth more than the money. If the customer wants a loaf of bread and has $4 in her pocket, well, okay, this bread has to be worth more than the $4 in the pocket, otherwise, at this moment, otherwise the customer wouldn't buy it. So the profit minus price minus cost, this area over here, is necessary for your profitability. The value minus profit is the value to the customer that's going to ensure that you have customers. Then you have to look, when you're talking about economies, when you're talking about making money, you have to look at location economies, which are the economy that arises from performing a value creation activity in an optimal location. Depending on what you're producing, obviously you want to produce it in the right place. You don't want to produce it in a place where the people don't want it, or where there's no market for it, or for whatever reason. Because to survive in a global market, it's beneficial to a firm to base each value creation activity on the location. Again, you want to make sure that the country or the place in which you're creating and selling the product is a place where there's a demand for that product. You have to look at economic conditions, political conditions, cultural conditions. Is the economy of that country, do they make enough money to pay this kind of a price? Does their political structure frown on the product you're making, or do they put value in the product you're making? The culture of that country, are they likely to like your product or not? Firms can also create global web of value, which means that you have different aspects of your product that are valued differently in different locations around the globe. Some of your products may sell well in the United States, some of your products may sell well in India. Location economies, of course, are lower costs of value creation. If you specifically tailor your product toward the place in which it's going to have its highest value, well, then you're going to be able to spend less to create more value. It's a low-cost position because you're creating it in the place where it actually is going to be sold. You don't have to ship it. And a firm can differentiate their product from other firms by tailoring their products to that particular location. The things that we have to take into account include things like political conditions, as we discussed before, economic conditions, rules and regulation regarding foreign investment. If their country is hostile to foreign investment, you might not be able to set up factories in that country cheaply. Formal and informal trade barriers, tariffs, things like that. Movements in currency exchange rates. We talked about that before as well. You may not want to set up a factory in a country with a very volatile currency that may go way up, decreasing your ability to successfully manufacture and market that product. And also the quality of the local labor pool. If you're going to build a factory somewhere, if you're going to manufacture something somewhere, you want to make sure that the labor pool can sustain whatever business activities you need. You should locate, hopefully, in a country that's stable, has a free market system, not something where the government interferes with everything like, Venezuela or something, or Cuba. There's no dramatic upsurge in either inflation or private sector debt. These are things that cause the economy to become very volatile and could dramatically impact your business at a moment's notice. And of course, where the political, economic, cultural conditions are conducive to good performance. And finally, regarding location, we have to look at the idea of local responsiveness. Local responsiveness means how you respond to the market conditions that affect where you're selling your product. Some factors that are relevant to local responsiveness, in other words, lead to pressure to respond to certain aspects of the economy in that area, is differences in consumer tastes and preferences. Pressure emerges when consumers' tastes differ between countries. You may not be able to sell the same product in France as you do in England. Maybe the French have slightly different tastes in terms of food, in terms of products, cars, bicycles, whatever the case may be. When consumer tastes differ greatly between countries, then your marketing message has to be customized toward a local market. If you are in a country that values luxury, well, you might want to say that your product is luxurious. If you're in a country that values practicality, say that it's practical. If you're in a country that values savings, then say that your product is nice and thrifty and saves money. Differences in traditional practices and infrastructure, in other words, what can be sustained in that country. When there are significant differences in infrastructure, the kind of factories and raw materials that are available there. It may also require the firm to delegate manufacturers to foreign subsidiaries. Maybe in other countries can develop products cheaper and more efficiently and more in tune with what the local company wants. There was an example where when Disney World was building its place in Taiwan or Hong Kong or whatever it was, they specifically tailored it and they hired people from the local area to make it sensitive to the local culture. Differences in distribution channels. You have to understand how things can be moved. So can they be moved by truck? Are the roads good? Can they be moved by boat? Does it have a good system of channels? You have to understand how you can move products around the area. And of course, the demands of the host government have to be taken into account when determining how to run a business in any particular area. For Lesson 13, we're going to go into organizational architecture. In other words, building an organization in a way that is optimal for international business. Organizational architecture means the entire firm's organization. That includes the organizational structure, the control systems within the organization to make sure the organization runs properly, and of course the incentives to try to make sure that the people in the organization reach their goals as efficiently as possible. The structure includes the division of the organization into subunits, the decision-making responsibilities. You could have one group that's responsible for North American operations, one group that's responsible for European operations, one for Asian operations. Then you could divide that into one subunit for sales and one subunit for accounting and one subunit for marketing and one subunit for human resources, which includes cross-functional teams and pan-regional teams. You could have a group that's in charge of marketing for both Europe and Asia. You could have a group that is responsible for hiring people in both Canada and Mexico. Then you have control systems, which are metrics used to measure performance of subunits. This is how the company assesses itself. Something that's very important in academia, in schools, is assessment. Well, the same thing is true for companies. You want to try to assess your organization. How well is your sales teams doing? How well is your human resources teams doing? How do you assess these things? How do you measure them? What kind of statistics do you look for? These are the metrics, and they are also used to make judgments about how well managers are running those subunits. And of course, incentives are what you give your people, other than the fact they want the company to do well because they want to keep the company to stay in business, to keep their jobs. What additional incentives do you give them? Additional incentives such as raises, bonuses, commissions, things like that. It also includes the organization's processes, which means how the decision is made in an organization. How does an organization decide what to do? Does the CEO run everything? Does something go to the CFO? Does it go to the COO? Does it go to vice presidents, lower managers, middle managers? Who makes decisions? That's a process of an organization, and how work is performed within the organization. What are the processes in terms of who tells whom to do what and when? These are, of course, just included in the firm's architecture. There's organizational culture, which are values among the employees. Hopefully, if you have a really good organizational structure and you've done a good job building it, the norm will be to try to work hard and try to make the company money and try to be as efficient as possible. Is the organizational norm, is the organizational value to try to make the customer happy, or is the organizational norm and the organizational value to try to make sure that you have a nice long weekend and don't have to work more than you have to? Obviously, this is something that you, as a manager of an international firm, or really even a domestic firm, want to try to build in your organization to maximize the firm's profitability. The people are the employees, the human resources, and also the strategy used to compensate, retain, and recruit new people to work for your organization, and the types of people that you get in terms of their skills, values, and generally how they view the company, how they view the world, how they view the business. This is all part of the organizational architecture. This is a little, just a little diagram over here, pretty simple. The people really control everything in terms of the structure of the organization, how it's run. The incentives that control how people are given incentives to perform better and who controls them. The culture of the organization, the processes of the organization, they're all run by the people, but they are all critically important to the success of an organization. Okay, and involved in the organizational structure is the structure necessary to expand, because expansion is something that every company that either aspires to be an international business or already is an international business needs to do. If you don't expand, then you're just going to stay the size that you always were. You're not going to expand in terms of profits. You're not going to expand in terms of customers. Expanding a customer base is always a goal of every business. You don't want to stay stagnant and never have an opportunity to grow. When firms expand internationally, they often group their international activities into an international division. If you have an American division of something and then you start selling goods in Japan or in Europe, well, then you might want to open a component of the company to try to run those specific international organizations. Interestingly enough, according to a Harvard study, 60% of all firms that have expanded have initially adopted the international division structure. In other words, rather than just running the European division and the European sales out of the same people and the same offices and the same paradigms and the same strategies as you have always used for your American organization, you also try to instead of doing that from your home organization, you hire new people. You hire a new division specifically to run your European affairs, to run your Asian affairs, whatever the case may be. Firms with a functional structure at home often replicate this in the foreign market. If you have a good structure that's working at home, you have a good series of human resources and series of divisions, well, you try to replicate it. Try to build the same kind of structure that works in the same way, but with people who are experts at selling these goods in Europe or experts in selling these goods in Asia, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. Just try to take what you have at home and try to replicate it with different people that are specifically tailored towards that new market. Over time, manufacturing can also shift to foreign markets. If you manufacture your things in the US and then you realize it's going to be cheaper to do it in China, or you're going to have more favorable government conditions in some other countries, you may, not necessarily, but you may decide to increase some manufacturing in foreign areas. Also, you may manufacture in those areas in order to be able to sell there without having to ship. If General Motors, for example, wants to sell cars in China, well, one option is to keep making them in Detroit and putting them on boats, or first on trucks, and then take them to California and put them on boats and send them all the way to China. Another possibility is to open up a manufacturing plant in China to make General Motors cars. Control systems and incentives, of course, another one of the things that we discussed before, is important relationship. The relationship between those two, of course, is an important component of the business, because incentives should be closely tied to performance metrics. So, for example, the incentive of a manager in charge of a national operating subsidiary can be linked to the performance of that company. So, for example, a control system tries to ensure that your Kentucky factory puts out 100,000 units a month. And so then you also might say, well, if your Kentucky factory puts out 100,000 units a month, then the manager who is in charge of that Kentucky factory gets a 10% bonus to her salary. That would just be an example of an incentive that's tied to a control system. You're giving the person who's running a particular aspect of your company a stronger incentive to perform well. Then you have changes in organization. Organizations cannot stay stagnant. Organizations do have to change with the times. They could be good changes or they could be remedial changes. In other words, you could change just because you want to expand and get bigger and you bring in new personnel who are expert at that, or they could be because things are going badly in a particular area and certain people or certain structures have to be replaced. So a change needs to there are many different possibilities. These are just examples of what may precipitate the need for changes in an organization. One would be to unfreeze the organization through shock therapy. Now, this is obviously not literal, literally shock your employees, in most cases anyway. It's just if a company is not doing well or a company is not growing for whatever reason, you may need to take bold actions. Closing a plant, structural reorganizations, firing and hiring the president or the CEO of the company, and a new CEO of the company. That may be necessary to kind of change the firm culture if things are stagnant or things are not going well. You can move the organization to a new state, or a new country, I suppose, through a change in architecture. This doesn't mean physical architecture, this means architecture of the firm itself. You move it to, and again, new state doesn't literally mean in Pennsylvania to Ohio. It means a new circumstance, a new just to change the way you do business. It requires a change in organizational structure and a new strategic posture. Maybe until now your goal was to sell things through stores, to sell your products through stores, and now you're going to change that and stop marketing to stores and instead marketing everything through your website. Or you can refreeze the organization in its new state, really is the third step over here, to try to make sure that whatever new structure you put in, new organization, new paradigm in terms of marketing, you make sure that that will be the culture from now on. And finally, we end this chapter with a discussion of the reason to centralize your decision-making structure. Decision-making structure are the people who make the major decisions for the company. People, of course, like the CEO, the president, are the top-level decision makers. Then you go further down and you get lower-level decision makers. Some of the reasons are it helps avoid duplication of activities. If you have many different people in every branch making their own decisions, well, they could duplicate. They could infringe on each other's markets. They could, two different branches might have a website that's marketing to the same people, and they're competing with each other. Certainly, you don't want to compete with yourself. You don't want to have different branches or different franchises competing with each other of your business. But if you have one centralized management mechanism that makes the decisions together, in a holistic way when looking at the entire company, you can avoid that. You can facilitate coordination between divisions and subsidiaries. Your factory in Kentucky has to be on the same page as your human resources department in California. You want to make sure, again, not to contradict each other, not to do things that will drag each other down. By concentrating power in one individual or a small team, you can give top-level managers the ability to give needed organizational changes. In other words, you give people power to actually carry out their vision. And, of course, you can ensure that your decisions are consistent with the overall objectives of the organization. If you have too many people managing, it just doesn't work. As they say, too many cooks spoil the broth. That's the old expression. So that's, again, a good reason for centralized decision-making. And our final chapter of this course goes into strategy and structure, and more specifically discusses with ways in which you can expand, ways in which you can get other companies or other people to become centralized within your organization. So, general principles: in order for a firm to succeed, the strategy has to be consistent with the environment in which the firm operates. You want to be able to have realistic projections and realistic goals, and the sort of thing that gives you the ability to operate in a way that makes sense. The structure has to be internally consistent. You don't want to have contradictions within your own organization, of course. The firm's organizational architecture must be consistent in strategy. Firms need to reflect changes in their environment. And of course, the strategy has to be consistent with competitive conditions prevalent in the marketplace. All of these things, what this really means is that all of these things have to be taken into account. You want to make sure that your goals, or if you have intense competition in a particular industry, it might not be realistic to assume that you can take over 10% of the industry overnight. If the competition is very weak, maybe it is more realistic. These are all things that have to be taken into account. Ways in which you can expand include really all the things we're going to discuss between now and the end of the chapter. First is a joint venture. Joint venture is you have a firm that's owned by two or more otherwise independent companies. For example, AT&T and Bell South went into business back in 15 years ago or so, and they formed Singular Wireless LLC, which was a wireless company. Now they don't exist anymore, but that was one example of a joint venture. Two big companies can go into business together to support one particular venture where they make a product, where they market a product, one project example. Most joint ventures are 50-50. I don't know about most, but certainly many. Fuji and Xerox established a venture between Fuji Photo and Xerox, again just one example, to market maybe something that's kind of on the intersection between two companies. Google and Nokia. Who built Google's phones? Nexus. No, I'm sorry, that was the model. I mean, you see this a lot in general with with these companies. A Google phone might be built by Motorola, which is kind of a joint venture where it's kind of on the intersection of what the companies do. Motorola builds phones, and Google creates internet-connected products. So if you have a phone that's programmed by Google to run on the Google server and use Google Docs and whatnot, and then you have Motorola making it, that's kind of a joint venture where they go in it together. The PC that Google makes, the Chromebook, I think, is made by Acer. I think, which is a company that makes cheap laptops, and Google makes, Chrome and Google Docs and Google Spreadsheets and Google all those other things. So they got together and they said, what? Why don't you build a cheap PC that won't have all the functionality of a regular PC, but it will be able to browse the internet and do everything on Google platforms. And so they got together and they created a little joint venture and created the Chromebook. And you can buy a Chromebook. And again, it's cheap. It doesn't do as much as a regular laptop, but it is a lot cheaper. Of course, in a joint venture, there are certain things you got to watch out for, and you have to protect proprietary information. If Google's going into business with Acer, it has to make sure that whatever intellectual property it has, whatever backrooming program it has that it owns the intellectual property to, is not given up. Proprietary information includes trade secrets, formulas, design, patterns, practice, process, instruments, which is not generally known. Processes that can be patented. You can get a patent on a particular process. It could also be trade secrets, things that a company makes or that a company develops, a company designs, and other people don't know the secret, like the Coca-Cola secret formula. If Coca-Cola went into business with McDonald's or something to market Coca-Cola products in McDonald's stores, well, they'd have to probably make sure that their process by which they make the drink was not shared. It's the sort of thing that businesses going into joint ventures have to make sure that they protect their own intellectual property. There are strategies to protect this proprietary information. One of them is to hold majority ownership in the venture so that you have greater control over technology. That's not always possible. Otherwise, you can wall off from the partner the technology. Google can make sure that Acer has the ability to install Google products on the Chromebook, but doesn't have the ability to actually see the in-house design of these products, and doesn't have the ability to copy them or to replicating them. Then you have acquisitions. Acquisitions is when one company buys another company. If I want to expand into Japan, I can either set up a factory there, I can do other things, or I can just buy a Japanese company and put it into my empire. It's a good strategy for entering foreign markets where there's a well-established competitor. If you can't beat them, join them. Or in this case, if you can't beat them, buy them. Acquisitions can succeed because they get interacted in. Law firms do that. For example, you might have a big New York law firm that wants to have an office in Memphis, Tennessee. So rather than going out and sending a few people down to Memphis to open up a law firm, they just buy a law firm in Memphis, buy a smaller firm that they can afford to buy, and now all of a sudden, instantly, they've got an office in Memphis. Now, acquisitions can fail because there could be a culture clash. The American hierarchy might not understand how to run this Japanese company that they've just bought. The acquiring firm can overpay, can pay too much to try to get into the market, and then realize that they paid too much and it's not worth it. It's not giving them returns on their investments. Attempting to realize synergies can cause problems. Synergies means the companies now have to work together. Okay, I make tablets, and I bought a Japanese company that makes tablets. But do we make the same kind of tablets? Do we run our organizations in the same way? Do we have the same goals? Do we have the same way of looking at things? If we don't, then trying to convert the company that I acquired to our way of doing things might not be so easy. There could be inadequate pre-acquisition screening. Maybe the company is doing badly financially, or maybe they have liabilities, or maybe they have bad personnel. And we didn't do our due diligence, we didn't do enough of an investigation, we bought the company anyway. That could be a problem. To avoid acquisition failure, what you want to do is you want to carefully screen the company you're going to acquire, and also you want to implement an integration plan. A comprehensive and well thought out plan to kind of merge the cultures of the two companies. Other ways, if you don't want to actually buy the company, you don't want to go into a joint venture, other ways to expand into foreign markets include licensing and franchising. We discussed this earlier in the course, but we'll do it again here. The licensor, Apple or whatever it is, grants the rights to its intangible property, namely the process of how the iPhone is built and used, in exchange for royalties. Used to be, for a while, AT&T was the only firm that could market the iPhone. That might have been a joint venture, I don't remember offhand, or it might have been a licensing where AT&T had the ability to, it was the only one that had the license to supply iPhones with their service on it. Doesn't apply anymore, but that was for the first couple of years. License is held for a specific time period. You can you can license a patent, the right to somebody else to use this patent, to use the product that is patented, inventions, formulas, designs, copyrights, trademarks, which are all things that are developed by a company and then licensed out to another company. Then you've got franchising, which is a kind of license. It's probably more integrated. Franchising is where the main company gives a right of a sub-company to operate under its name and to use its formulas. For example, CVS, we all know, is a nationwide drugstore chain. So if I'm CVS, if I want to open up a CVS store, I go to CVS. Or first I'd probably have to find the location, find the business plan, find the money to get started. I'd go to CVS and I'd say, okay, can I open up a CVS? And they would say, okay, what are your plans? And I'd show them my plans, and they'd look to see whether my plans make sense. Do I have the money? Do I have the personnel? Do I have the space? And they'd also look to see maybe, are there any other CVSs that are too close? You don't want CVSs competing with each other too much. That wouldn't be good for the company. And so they say, okay, we'll give you a franchise agreement. And the franchise agreement, I pay a yearly fee, whatever that fee may be, $100,000, whatever the case may be. And in exchange, I get the benefits of CVS. CVS tells me how to operate. They give me tips and secrets that they use. And I'm also, of course, part of their advertising mechanism. When they advertise CVS on TV, people come to my CVS because I'm the local branch of it. So the franchisor insists that the franchisee abide by rules. CVS might tell me, you're not allowed to sell cigarettes, or I think that's a new CVS rule. Or they say you have to carry our brand of aspirin, or they say you have to carry, certain drugs, whatever. You have to not carry certain things. You have to display certain things. You have to display candy around Halloween time, whatever. The point is they might have rules about how I operate. It usually involves a longer-term commitment. It might be a 5-year deal or a 10-year deal, and it's also used a lot in food service industries, restaurants. Rather than opening up your own burger shop, you can go to Wendy's, or you can go to Chick-fil-A or whatever, and get a licensing agreement. Then they give you the formulas, they give you the recipes, they give you their advertising, they let you use their logos, they let you use their models, they let you use whatever, and in exchange you pay a franchising fee, but you also agree to be governed by their rules. If they say you have to have at least 4 custodians in the building, and then you have to follow those rules. And of course, for licensing can help for international expansion because the firm doesn't have to bear the development costs or risks. Franchising or licensing, it's the individual business owner that has to deal with it. It's the individual business owner that's going to put in the investment. The firms can pursue a foreign market without committing a significant amount of resources, again, because it's the firm in the other country, it's the person in the other country, the business owner, that's really taking the risk. The firm can avoid barriers to investment. You're not really investing in another company. You don't have to worry about the other company's importation laws because it's all being done in that country. And you can capitalize in market opportunities without developing it yourself. You don't have to go in and develop the infrastructure. Somebody else will do that for you. Your licensee will do that for you. And that brings us to the end of Lesson 14, and that brings us to the end of our crash course for international business. Please contact us if you have any questions. Thank you very much for watching. Good luck on the final exam, and good luck in general.